Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. I'm so thankful to my Savior, Jesus Christ, that I am here with you today. Yesterday, I was eating fried okra after racing an AMG through mud and flood-covered roads in the Ozark Mountains while investigating the land, livestock, and timber holdings of an obscure Mormon commune which settled there in 1955 and astoundingly still exists in secret. Earlier in the week, I was doing the same thing at Deseret Ranches of North Florida. The parallels are remarkable. I drove 6,275 dangerous miles in the past month, and only by the grace of God I'm alive. So thanks for inviting me, Steve and Justin. My name is John HAJICEK. I have exactly 50 years' experience as a student of contested Mormon history, owing to my upbringing, and 40 years in the authentication and acquisition of Joseph Smith rare books and documents. And I presently curate hundreds of thousands of items of Mormon material culture. My graduate school education, though, was in the history of economic theory. This might surprise you. Dallin Oaks is one of my favorite people. He's one of my favorite people for 12 reasons. First, that's my Dallin Oaks imitation. First, because his first name is from the most famous of all Mormon sculptors, Cyrus Dallin. Second, because his middle name is Harris, owing to him being a kin of Martin Harris, the earliest Mormon convert. Thank you. Fourth, because he is one of the scholars of the so-called New Mormon history. Can I see a show of hands of people who know what I mean when I use the phrase New Mormon history? Good, okay. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Dallin Oaks in the 1960s served on the board of editors of the Dialogue magazine, which is the beginning of New Mormon history. Fifth, because his elegant wife, Kristen, is a patron of Mormon history and a supporter of real philanthropy. Sixth, I should be using my accent. Sixth, because he presided over BYU, where I later sent my two elegant daughters to college to study history and philanthropy, respectively. Seventh, because Dallin Oaks is an unwavering champion of religious liberty. Eighth, because he's one of the greatest legal minds of our day. Follow his work. Ninth, because we worked on opposite sides of a legal case for 21 years in which he was intimately involved. He's a fierce opponent, but I steadily prevailed, writing most of my own legal briefs, including one for the Supreme Court, until at last he and his boss let me have and protect 4 Nauvoo temple sun-faced capital stones called sunstones, fulfilling a promise originally made to me by President Hinckley. 10th, I like him because he numbers the paragraphs in his talks. 11th, because he's the earliest of the true Carthage researchers. And 12th, because he is a Carthage conspiracy theorist, having written a landmark book on our subject and entitling it Carthage Conspiracy, published by the University of Illinois in 1975. So if anyone calls you a conspiracy theorist, tell them that conspiracies are real and that the Carthage conspiracy is real. We just don't know the names of all the people in the conspiracy. But what is undisputed is that one of them was William Law, the predecessor to Dallin H. Oaks. And that there are also 2 Higbee brothers who were kin to then future President Heber J. Grant. That is not in dispute. Were John Taylor and Willard Richards co-conspirators? We don't really know. I first presented this theory in a talk in Independence, Missouri, in the early 1990s. My early 1990s theory found 100 problems with the traditional martyrdom tale. There were inconsistencies in the statements of Willard Richards and inconsistencies in the statements of John Taylor. Then there are also contradictions between them. Separately, there were conflicts with the stories by others who were in the mob or observers. And finally, all the accounts were juxtaposed against the physical evidence described that day, and in some cases, physical evidence which is still in existence. You may not agree with the compelling interpretation shown today. There is more than one reasonable interpretation of the same evidence. Taylor and Richards had recently risen to power during the earliest imprisonment of Joseph and Hiram in Liberty. They were not eyewitnesses to the founding events of the Restoration in Palmyra, Manchester, Fayette, or Harmony. There's more than one reasonable interpretation to two witnesses of the Restoration being utterly unwilling to sufficiently and utterly unwilling to consistently describe the principal event in the lifetime of Joseph Smith to which they were eyewitnesses. But there is more than one reasonable interpretation to the separate Mormon dietary principles we call the word of wisdom, which we suppose is the unequivocal voice of God. So let us summarize what all historians acknowledge. These are the undisputed facts. This will sound like rhetoric, but I assure you that these are the undisputed facts from even the most traditional of stories. This summary comes from my social media post last July 27th. Number one, Joseph and Hiram Smith were shot in their backs while inside the jailer's upstairs bedroom of the Hancock County Jail while protected by the Illinois governor. 2, a lynch mob came up the stairs to take them alive and hang them in the public square, but the Smiths had guns for self-defense and faced down the mob. 3, when the Smiths shot down the stairs, the mob scattered back down the stairs. 4, a moment later, Hiram was shot in the back. 5, Joseph was then shot in the back inside the room while leaping out the window into the mob outside, crying out for Masonic sympathy. 6, Joseph and Hiram were Masons. 7, witnesses said that an anti-Mason publisher, W.W. Phelps, was inside the room and armed, besides 2 other New Mormons who were armed. When the Smiths were killed, there were many bullet holes in the wall and 2 in the door. 9, might have forgot the 8 there, but that was 8. 9, the bullet holes were pistol-sized and low on the wall towards which the Smiths were facing. 10, a member of the Smiths' first presidency, William Law, is traditionally implicated as part of the assassination. 11, Joseph apparently told his other siblings that he would be killed by insiders. 12, many of his 12 had apostatized. 13, but the mob then fired on Joseph on the ground outside the jail where he was still breathing when he landed below the window. 14, and lastly, later that night, members of the mob at an anti-Mormon bar in nearby Warsaw allegedly boasted that they killed Joseph. These are all factual sentences. Phelps was responsible for getting Joseph and Hiram imprisoned in Liberty Jail, the Clay County Jail, and in Carthage Jail, the Hancock County Jail. Frequently excommunicated, Phelps manipulated his way back into the confidence of Joseph Smith like a piece of lead type was manipulated into his ghostwriting. And Phelps preached the funeral of Joseph and Hiram Smith, and then wrote the martyrdom section of the Book of Doctrine and Covenants. The New Mormon history, I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. So the New Mormon history was founded in the 1960s. Probably it's disputable about how they transitioned into the New Mormon history, but they start using the term about 1970. The founders of the New Mormon history are people like Jan Ships, if you've heard of her as an author, Richard Bushman, and Dick Howard, Richard P. Howard at the Community of Christ, which was on the Reorganized Church. Those guys today are in their 90s. Bushman is 91. Dick Howard is 93. These are guys I know. Richard Bushman has emailed me a couple of times in the last maybe month or so. Dick Howard's been in my house. Jan Ships I had lunch with last time she was in town alone with her. So I don't mean to be shy about saying they're in their 90s, but they're in their 90s. And so the New Mormon history is now the Old Mormon history to me. These are people that Richard Bushman, for example, graduated from high school, or graduated from college, I think it was in 1945 with his history degree, and got his or in the 1940s, and got his PhD in the 1950s. So I'm looking forward to like a post-New Mormon history. And I want to talk a little bit about what that might look like, and I think you've seen it tonight. At the annual conference, the Mormon History Association, which I attended just a couple of months ago at Utah State University, there were 290 people who presented papers. Not a single paper had to do with the Joseph Smith period of the church. They were all social issues, contemporary, modern social issues. So Mormon history has been left behind. There's nobody that's writing maybe the Joseph Smith papers, which is winding up. But really, the Joseph Smith period is being left behind by 290 scholars that met together at the Mormon History Association. The most popular lecture at that conference was entitled, "A History of the Mormon Smile." So that's why I like Justin. This is real Mormon history. Everybody here knows about your church status, right? I don't think a Mormon historian has been excommunicated for being a Mormon historian since Michael Quinn, if you know who he was. I think says a lot. Michael Quinn was a good historian, part of the new Mormon history, but he was a good historian. Fawn Brodie in 1945 sort of was ahead of the rest of what we came to call the New Mormon history. Fawn Brodie's book, No Man Knows My History, was published by Alfred A. Knopf Publishers in New York City. Alfred A. Knopf Publishers published Richard Bushman's book in 2005. So there's a 60-year span between this ground-breaking book by Fawn Brodie, which changed Mormon history, and then Richard Bushman, who tries to do it again in 2005. But they come from the same publisher. They're the same camp. They're the same school of thought called the New Mormon History. And the problem with Fawn Brodie's book, really, as lots of reviewers said, and have said since, is that it framed what we thought was important in Mormon history, and therefore discouraged historians from looking outside of what her narrative was. Instead, we looked to her narrative and tried to correct her narrative or amplify her narrative, depending on which side we're on. And then Richard Bushman sort of tries to replace her, so he's in the same group. They're not talking about these kinds of issues that the people in this room are interested in talking about. Jan Ships, the other historian I mentioned in the New Mormon History, called Richard Bushman's book the crowning achievement of the New Mormon History. And what the New Mormon History is for Bushman, it's a synthetic history. It's almost like a Wikipedia article. It attempts to summarize and include the current thought. It synthesizes and brings together into one place all of the current academic thought on Mormon history. So what Richard Bushman is doing is Richard is in a classroom or a cubicle, and he's reading scholarly journals and student papers, and he's kind of forms his whole narrative for Rough Stone Rolling in classrooms and cubicles, as opposed to somebody like me I'm a Mormon material culture historian. I'm buried up to my elbows in documents every day, and I've been buried in them for 42 years. And if there's any advice I could give to anybody, it's, immerse yourself in Joseph Smith period documents if you want to understand Joseph Smith. You don't go, I refuse to read the 1880s documents. And I have started to now, later in life, but for many, many decades, I just buried myself in like the Times and Seasons from Nauvoo, the Evening and the Morning Star from Nauvoo, things I have original copies of. And it was almost like I lived there. It was almost like I could talk about Nauvoo like I had lived in Nauvoo, because I'd read all the papers and read all the letters and the documents. And I didn't care what Elizar Snow said 50 years later happened in Nauvoo. But that's what the New Mormon historians do, and that's one of those dangers of the New Mormon history. So it's a synthetic history. It's based on reminiscent accounts and later history. And they don't weigh that evidence. So the number one thing I notice about that school of thought, I sometimes call it the Utah school of thought or the New Mormon history. It's not used by other historians at other universities around the country. This is unique to Mormon history, where they have this idea that all documents have equal weight, they're all used, they're accepted on their face as authentic and credible. So you get to a situation where Richard Bushman wants to handle the story of the seer stones. So he has accounts of Joseph Smith using an Urim and Thummim. And Richard Bushman, doesn't really want to be out of the church, doesn't really want to be in it, I think, sometimes. Half of people that read his book think it's apologetic and half think it's anti-Mormon. And he kind of wants it that way, right? And it's because it's viewed that way because he's using everything. So he actually pretends to believe, maybe he does believe, that Joseph Smith in part used an Urim and Thummim. But then he finds another piece where Joseph had a dark seer stone, not quite black, and he has another seer stone that's white, and then there's another seer stone that might be green, and another seer stone that might have a hole in it, another one that might have brown stripes. And Richard Bushman takes these little pieces from all the different accounts, and instead of saying, we don't know what happened, there's conflicting evidence, he says it all happened. You have to believe all women and you have to believe all documents. And so he says Joseph Smith used an Urim and Thummim, and then he used this seer stone on this date, and then he must have used this seer stone on this date. And sometimes the plates were in the room, sometimes they were buried, sometimes there was a blanket or a curtain, and sometimes there weren't. And he tries to cram them in order and insists that Joseph Smith was changing the Book of Mormon translation process. And it's because he's cramming these pieces like jigsaw puzzles where they don't fit. The fact is, we don't know how the Book of Mormon was translated. We know what Joseph Smith said. We know what Oliver Cowdery said. We know what others said. And we rely on faith, or we try to sort it out, and you try to weigh the evidence. You may weigh earlier sources. You may weigh manuscript sources heavier. You may think maybe a published source is actually better because a published source is less likely to be a forgery. But you weigh a handwritten document before a typed document. There are, by the way, and I'm going to be writing about this, I'm gathering, there's a whole lot of documents that are published in the 1800s that don't exist, that they never existed. They're written by fictitious people talking about the Joseph Smith period of the church. So reading a document in a journal from the 1880s or the 1920s might not be a document. We want to know where that document is today. So I'm a Mormon material culture historian, and I'm looking at documents not online, not on a smartphone, not in a typescript. I want to hold the document and examine the document and look at the paper. How was the paper made? Where did the paper originate? Where did the ink originate? What's the order of chronology in the editorial changes in the document? What's in the margins? What is the provenance for the document? Who held it? Who owned it? Who revised it? And by the way, that problem arises best in William Clayton's diaries. And this has been a problem for me since 1988. I went to the LDS Church Archives and asked to look at the William Clayton diaries. And that's one of the reasons I got so heavily involved in making my own acquisitions. But you can't see the actual William Clayton diaries. Instead, they leaked out typescripts. And the people who leaked them and the controversy that followed the leaking of William Clayton's typescripts, that's a fishy story that we don't know everything about. It seems to me like they leaked out things that actually support the church's version of things, and I want to know where the original is. So I don't believe the typescripts. I'm skeptical. And as a material culture historian, I want to look at those originals. So finally, with the publication of the Joseph Smith papers, there are few things that fit in the parameter of the Joseph Smith papers that were in the William Clayton diaries. And so they finally gave us photographs of just a few pages. And those photographs, in my opinion, and I handle diaries every day. I buy diaries every day. And it's not a real diary. A real diary from the 1830s and the 1840s looks like it was written on a boat and on a horse and in the rain and on a pew in the church and by candlelight and in the dark, maybe on a tree stump, maybe in the field. And the pen changes every day and the slant of the hand changes every day. But when you look at William Clayton's diary, it is a clean diary. Historians sometimes call it a fair copy. A fair copy is one that's prepared for publication later or for viewing by other people later. It really, I can't be sure, by the way, I haven't examined the diary still, but it looks to me like that's a really nice diary in really nice condition. And that guy didn't maybe ever ride a horse, I don't know, but that diary is way too clean. It looks like it's written in one sitting, and maybe it was a week, I don't know, but it's a cleaned up diary. That bothers me when I grow to understand that the only document that really anybody ever points to prove that Joseph Smith, because I always say, look, there are no children from any polygamous marriages, and there are no documents. And everybody always says, yeah, what about William Clayton's diary? Well, William Clayton's diary is a problem, and I would challenge the church to bring that out. What's so secretive in that diary? I collect newspapers. I have hundreds of, maybe 100,000 newspapers, individual issues. I have the Evening and the Morning Star from Independence, Missouri in 1832 through 1834 when it ended in Kirtland, through James Strang's Northern Islander published on Beaver Island, the only known copy. I just love old newspapers. But there's one newspaper I love to collect just for fun, and it's an 1834 newspaper account that appeared in almost every credible newspaper in the country. And it's 1834 account of Joseph Smith's martyrdom. But you heard today the martyrdom happened in 1844, and I just said 1834. Joseph Smith's death was reported nationally in 1834. We don't know why. I thought maybe the newspapers were rushing the story. My research assistant and girlfriend Anna says, maybe Joseph Smith leaked that because he needed to get back to Ohio. He needed safe passage back from Liberty, Missouri, where he was there with Zion's Camp trying to get back to Ohio after trying to rescue the saints in Missouri. So we don't know, but it's interesting how two different people can look at the same situation. There's more than one reasonable interpretation. The problem is, with the 1834 newspaper, is that Richard Bushman believes all history. So really, Richard Bushman has to admit that Joseph Smith was killed twice. And it goes right along with him believing he used all these different colors of seer stones. My friend Dick Howard in Independence, though, is more of the truth is always in the middle kind of a new Mormon historian. So somewhere, maybe in 1839, Joseph Smith was killed because the truth is, Justin's wrong. The truth is between 1834 and 1844. And the New Mormon historians still have their sacred cows, though. The enemies of Mormon are basking in this change in the church history department because they're all in the same school of thought now. The church historians that work for BYU in the church history department are in the same exact school of thought and camp as the anti-Mormon historians. They won't allow more than one interpretation of the same evidence, even if there's conflicting evidence. If there's conflicting evidence, you have to accept it all or at least take a Utah-centric worldview. So, for example, if Emma Hale Smith and Eliza Roxy Snow disagree, we must take the side of Snow. You have to take the Utah-centric view regardless. And so you have to protect John Taylor. He has descendants here. And, you know, we can believe that the Book of Mormon witnesses were misled. Emma Smith was misled. Joseph Smith's family was misled. Even members of the 12 in the First Presidency, but not anyone that came to Utah. We can believe the Laws, the Fosters, the Higbees, the Ivanses helped kill Joseph Smith. Oh, I think I said Heber J. Grant was related to the Higbees. I think it was the Ivans. But they helped kill Joseph Smith, but not Willard Richards, because unlike the others, Richards went to Utah, where he again ordered killings for financial gain. And that's provable. We can believe that W.W. Phelps helped get Joseph Smith into Liberty Jail, for which he was excommunicated, but not into Carthage Jail, because he soon afterwards went to Utah. It is permitted for the New Mormon history to call the Book of Mormon an allegory, so long as the historian doesn't criticize the Utah pioneers. That's the standard. And the polygamy marriages. You know, if you identify a previously hitherto unknown wife of Joseph Smith, you're immediately welcomed into the fold of credentialed historians. That makes you a credentialed historian. It reminds me of, you go to these John Whitmer Historical Association meetings or the Mormon History Association meetings, and part of the way that you succeed is you shock, right? It's sort of like a comedian who uses profanity, vulgarity, or obscenity in a comic routine. He's doing it for that. That's what the Mormon historians are doing. And so they want to find wives of Joseph Smith. And they do. I've watched the wives proliferate from 33 to 50 in just recent years. If an accusation, gossip, rumor, hearsay, reminiscence, or Victorian folklore was recorded 10, 40, or even 60 years later, that woman was married to Joseph Smith. It only takes a third-hand account. You can say in 1910 that my grandmother on her deathbed said she was married to Joseph, and now she is. That's the New Mormon history. She absolutely is. You can't dispute that. You can't refute it. No children. So the New Mormon history requires us to believe that she was. There's no standard of evidence that we prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, which is if it's criminal, or with clear and convincing evidence, which is if it's fraud, or even the preponderance of evidence if it were a civil matter. Only the slimmest of evidence is needed. She's not cross-examined, no rebuttal witnesses are permitted, no defense case is allowed. If we do genealogy and find out that she was too young to be married to Joseph Smith, she's not impeachable. Rather, the New Mormon history requires us to believe that Joseph Smith married children. If we find that she actually had a different husband at the time she claims she was married to Joseph Smith, she's not impeached. Rather, the New Mormon history requires us to believe that Joseph married the wives of other men. They are the conspiracy theorists, compelling readers to believe in 50 wedding conspiracies without a single shred of documentation and with no pregnancies. Going back to the seer stones, when Richard Bushman describes dark, white, green, black, brown, we have to believe those sources are equally true, and the conflicting puzzle pieces must be crammed together in a chronological narrative. But what we should be doing is we should be writing the story of the story. At other universities around the country, when people write about history, they write the story of the story. So we want to talk about how the understanding of how Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon evolved. What were the first things said in 1828, and then what was said in 1830, and rather not believe them both, but let's just tell the story of how that story changed and what impact Martin Harris had on the neighbors of Joseph Smith. What did Isaac Hale say in 1834? And then what did Emma say in 1879? Was she influenced by Isaac Hale? When Emma Smith spoke about it in 1879, does that influence David Whitmer when David Whitmer writes about it in 1887? And so you watch this story change and evolve, and it's still changing today. That to me is more important than to say that, look, I have 8 people talking about how Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, so he did it all the ways. The miracle of the quail is the same way, which can be measured quantitatively as growing with each generation, like a Pinocchio nose. There's more quail to each with each retelling. You need to see the 1846 diaries. The transfiguration, which can be observed as growing in credibility with each generation, like a Pinocchio nose. Brigham Young is more transfigured with each retelling. See the 1844 diaries. The Hoffman forgeries, which I refuted as a teenager in 1981, the church continued to buy. Let me say, not the church, let's say it like this. The New Mormon historians continued to buy the Hoffman documents for 4 more years after I said to Time and Newsweek that they weren't authentic in 1981. His documents still get the approbation of Mormon historians. They're accustomed to typescripts who know nothing about documents as physical artifacts. By the way, I dictated this while I was driving, so there's a few bumps in here. And there's still documents being discovered. They're not a lot. They're extremely rare. They're very expensive when they show up. I try to stand side by side with representatives of the LDS Church. I usually outbid them. The reason I outbid them is because they come with a fixed maximum. And I know that if they bid $10,000 on a document, I probably can't go wrong bidding $10,100, but somebody told them they can't spend more than $10,000. So it's a great way to compete. This week I bought documents from Warren Parrish discussing the Kirtland Bank and a document involving William Law in the 1830s. Remember, we're talking about William Law in 1844. There's a document that I acquired this week involving William Law, correspondence with anti-Mormonism in the 1830s. Daguerreotypes, which get the approbation of Mormon historians who examine photographs. They examine them on their cell phones, on their smartphones, and they say, wow, that looks like Joseph Smith. You can see it in his eyes. That's the new Mormon history. We have to accept any daguerreotype that another member of our club, another new Mormon historian says is Joseph Smith. We have to accept that. And once again, the new Mormon historians have misidentified Joseph Smith. The new Mormon history works like archaeologists, each one layered upon the work of another, who work upon the layers of another. Again, like when I talk about Richard Bushman writing a synthesis, you know, if another PhD or even a master degreed historian writes an article about something, then somebody else who has a PhD like Richard Bushman at Columbia, he can use that, he can accept that without further examination of the documents. It's sort of like, it's almost like a priesthood, you know, PhD ordaining PhD, but they're layering things like the way archaeologists make mistakes when they're digging through layers, and then that mistake is perpetuated. Just as an example, this is a simple, easy to understand example. You've heard of Louisa Beaman, purportedly a wife of Joseph Smith. Hey, you've seen her picture. It's a picture of Louisa Stout. Hosea Stout, he was the head of the police force in Nauvoo, and that's his wife. They were patrons of the arts, and they got their images made by Sutliff Maudsley, an artist, and they were lithographed by a lithographer, another artist, Robert Campbell, in Nauvoo, and made several copies, and it's Louisa Stout. It's always been Louisa Stout until one historian, one of the new Mormon historians who didn't know his Mormon history, misidentified it, too anxious to prove the polygamy story and illustrate a book, called it Louisa Beaman, and that error is now perpetuated indefinitely. You can't really stop it. So the New Mormon history is noble, it's majestic in how it positioned itself. We're the New Mormon historians. Nothing else matters. We're we carry that scepter, right? So to comply with the New Mormon history, John Taylor must believe, and he recounts Joseph and Hiram shot by muskets. Willard Richards was unarmed, but afterwards he says he guarded the bodies with his own shotgun. In Utah, Taylor said he would kill a man to save the church. And also in Utah, Richards voted to kill native humans merely to save a Mormon cow. Who is this guy, Willard Richards, that can vote to shoot humans to save a cow? And how do the New Mormon historians laugh at me? How do they laugh at us for saying we think Willard Richards was a killer? He was. It's not disputed. This is in the church's own archives that Willard Richards wanted to shoot people to save a cow. I'll quit there.